We too often create these binary views of the world that things are either all good or all bad, or right. The interesting aspects of things are really in the middle, in the gray zone. Believe it or not, Richard Nixon in the early 70s said healthcare was unsustainable. There was a cost crisis even back then. These tools are imperfectly reliable. So if we're going to apply an imperfectly reliable tool to a task, let's make sure there's a relatively low cost of making a mistake.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the AI Founders Podcast. I am your host, Jay Singh. I am also the CEO and co-founder of a AI product studio called Casper Studios. Today, we interviewed Spencer Dorn. Spencer is the vice chair and professor of medicine at UNC. He is also a LinkedIn top voice because he writes a lot about the intersection of healthcare and AI. We had a really fun conversation where we spoke about the history of different technological innovations in healthcare, how he thinks AI will or won't be at points the next version of that over the next 20, 30, 40 years, and to discuss different trends that he's seeing in the industry as well. Hope you all have a good time listening to the episode. Hey, Spencer. How are you?
Great to speak to you, Jay.
Thanks for coming on. One of the reasons why I really doing this podcast is because I'm pretty active on the interwebs, and whenever I see someone that I've been learning from the past year or so about AI in their specific space, I just end up reaching out and seeing if they want to come hang out and talk about what they've been writing about and sharing about. And this is an example of that too. So Spencer, thanks for all the good writing that you put out about the intersection of healthcare and AI, mainly on LinkedIn, it seems, versus like a Twitter, or maybe a little bit of both, but excited to go a layer deeper into some of the thoughts that you've been sharing and have a conversation that is relatively well-rounded versus everything's amazing about AI, or AI is going to be the doomer, and to try to be able to find that nuance that sometimes is harder to find when you're speaking online. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Awesome. I think it's all about nuance. We too often create these binary views of the world that things are either all good or all bad, or right. The interesting aspects of things are really in the middle, in the gray zone. Yeah, I'd love to explore that with you.
I think that's where the opportunities are too, where you can actually just take a step back and think a little bit more calmly about what the future could look like. Speaking of what the future could look like, I am not an expert in healthcare. Yourself, you are an expert in healthcare. And I'm curious, if you were to start to paint a picture in the next 20, 30 years, like where are the places where AI has really benefited the industry in a place where people aren't really necessarily thinking about today? And where are the places that you think may actually harm certain aspects of the healthcare system? I know it's a hard question, but yeah, curious to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we were chatting before this, it's hard to predict 20 or 30 years ago because we just don't know. If we were in 1990, could we have predicted what the internet would replace? There was no the concept of social media, the concept of businesses like Amazon, right? It was just completely unknown at the time. So I'm always reluctant to make long view predictions on where all this is going. But I think some broad general strokes from the positive aspect is hopefully we'll be empowered with better information so we can make better decisions. I think ultimately that's where the value of AI will come down to. Yes, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to automate annoying tasks that no one wants to do. But the long-term benefit, I think, of AI is helping us better understand human biology, clinical medicine, individuals as individual people, not lumped into big groups, so we can help make the best decisions for their health and well-being long-term. Kind of nebulous, but I think that's the ultimate hope. And you could extend that. I'm not a drug development expert, but there's a lot of interest and excitement of harnessing this technology to develop new therapies and new insights. So I would say long-term, the opportunities are to develop a better understanding of human biology and disease, so we could develop better therapeutics and also help personalize and improve decision-making for how to help people live better, healthier, happier lives.
I want to come back to the personalization piece because I think even without AI happening, those trends are already occurring across different industries, like different use cases. Everything is becoming more personalized. So I want to come back to that. Maybe instead of the future-looking perspective, could you give us a little bit of the history of the big technological movements that have been happening in the healthcare industry over the past, maybe, let's say 100 years? In my mind, I'm not someone who's super well familiar with the space, but it seems like at least one of those big shifts have been with EMRs, and maybe even a layer after the invention of them is the incentives that were put in place in, I think, 2009 or 2010 around getting administrators and doctors to be able to integrate. EMRs into their workflows. That seems definitely like one, but I think that is spoken about quite a bit. Do you have other pieces of these? Okay, like this new technological innovation came in and started to shift up how the industry is operating outside of the specific EMHR over the past maybe like 100 years? And if you want to go further back, feel free to.
I mean, EMR is a relatively recent phenomenon. Looking back, if you look at the broad strokes of American medicine, it was a cottage industry, not regulated, people doing their own thing. There were not really standards for who could practice medicine, what they were practicing, and there were all these different competing approaches per se. And there was a lot of hucksterism and just not a lot of benefits. Health medicine really wasn't delivering much benefit. And if you look at one of the seminal changes came in the early 1900s with attempts to better standardize and regulate and accredit medical schools. So that was one of the early steps to trying to get a better standardization of what it means to be a physician. What type of training does it take? Who can give you the license to practice, or at least the education so that you can then apply for the license. So that was a big step forward. Then if you look in the early 1900s, hospitals were actually places people went largely to die when they couldn't be cared for at home anymore. There were very few therapeutics we had. If you look back to the early 1900s, we didn't have antibiotics. We had very rudimentary surgical techniques and anesthesia. And there was just an overall generalization, like physicians tended to be general practitioners. Often they made house calls. So there wasn't this necessarily practice arrangement and business model where everyone came to the doctor. It was more the doctor going out to the patients, and hospitals were places where people went when their families couldn't care for them anymore. And slowly, with advances in our understanding of human biology, development of new therapies. I mentioned antibiotics, insulin, all these new therapies that started coming to revolutionize healthcare. We started to see generally the development of more healthcare as a profession, medicine as a profession, and started to create structures around the physician where now all of a sudden the physician was the locus, the center of gravity, and people would come into the doctor's office. And over time, we saw greater and greater specialization. For instance, I trained in internal medicine, and then I further trained in gastroenterology, and then I further trained in a small area of gastroenterology called functional GI motility disorders. Like that was not possible 100 years ago, even 5 years ago. Fields like dermatology were part of internal medicine. Neurology was part of internal medicine. There was no emergency medicine. Back even looking at the 1950s, it was a lot broader in scope, each discipline, because there was just less knowledge to manage and there was just less specialization. So we saw gradually over the past, hopefully I'm taking on an interesting journey, but we gradually saw over time deeper specialization as knowledge increased. And ultimately, if you start to approach the 1960s and 80s, the public started asking, what are we getting for all this, right? All of a sudden, healthcare is becoming very specialized or increasingly specialized, very expensive. Believe it or not, Richard Nixon in the early 70s said healthcare was unsustainable. There was a cost crisis even back then. And if you look at what started to happen is people started to say, we need to pay attention to what is happening in medicine. We need some standards of accountability. And healthcare started to have some external stakeholders looking at it and holding it more critically. And that's what kind of ultimately led to the quality movement and some of the payment systems that we have. So that was a big march in the 1980s and 90s. And then, as you mentioned, the 2000s, we saw the digitization of healthcare. So, for instance, when I was in medical school, we used paper records. When I was a resident, I used a very early, very rudimentary, highly functional actually, but very rudimentary electronic health record. And the notion that maybe if we digitize healthcare, we could lead to a lot of benefits. Maybe we could reduce waste. Maybe we can improve outcomes. And around 2008, when Obama came into office, there was this massive economic recession and they were looking for ways to stimulate the economy. And Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And they were looking for what was called shovel-ready initiatives, things you could just pump money into. And one of the laws that were passed was called the High-Tech Act, which led to this thing called meaningful use, which essentially incentivized individual physician practices and large health systems to implement and meaningfully use certified electronic health records. So that's really when we saw healthcare really start to digitize in the two. And what we've seen from that is a lot of benefit and a lot of drawbacks. We tend to focus more on the drawbacks, but there's been a lot of benefits. So I don't want to keep rambling, Jay, but I think overall, the history of medicine over the past century has been increasing
Mhm.
Professionalism and regulation, increasing specialization and depth of understanding, and then more recently, digitization. So that's the point we are at now.
I want to come back to the incentives piece and just get your reflections on policy initiatives like that. We'll always have pros and cons. Speaking of the nuance we were trying to find earlier. So curious to hear more of that in a moment. But so what you're highlighting for me is that over the past 100 and 150 years, 100 years, more information has led to more specialization. It's as the knowledge increased, then there was more surface area to go deeper into it. So,
Exactly.
and one thing that we're all feeling if you're using AI products is that personally, it feels like my knowledge can increase much larger because I can quickly prompt into something into ChatGPT or even frankly, even just Google something. So do we think that trend continues to increase because of AI, where there's more information that's created or maybe more information that's available to then specialize deeper into? Have you reflected on maybe that continuing over time? Or do you think there's other forces that make it so that actually specialization won't go deeper? Maybe it'll be more general. Have you considered that, especially in reflection?
Yeah, I think, yes, I think it could go both ways. So one of the beauties or the benefits of AI is it could democratize knowledge, right? And if I'm a hyper specialized physician, what do I have? I have deep knowledge in a certain area that few other people have. So AI could democratize knowledge so that you, Jay, could tap into the same knowledge that I may have, or so that your primary care or your generalist physician could tap into that knowledge. So that's certainly a possibility. The flip side is, right, if could AI lead to generate more knowledge on its own, finding patterns that we couldn't identify before, calling for even greater specialization. So I think it probably will have kind of both effects. One effect is you could say we won't need as much deep specialization because we will have more knowledge at our fingertips. The other is you could say we'll have more knowledge to manage that requires greater expertise in more focused areas. So I think it could go either way. It's hard to know. And I don't think they're mutually exclusive, right? I think in some ways, maybe we'll have more democratization of knowledge and need less specialization. On the flip side, we may have more information to manage and need more. One thing I'd say is or I should say another thing I'd say is there's this kind of oversimplification in healthcare. I think especially from people who haven't practiced that there's a right answer for everything, right? Or people tend to think there's a lot more certainty in medicine than really exists. And on the one hand, and different digital technologies can help create greater certainty, right? We can get the right information to make the right decision. But the flip side is that approach will only get us so far. So much of what we do is based on intuition, gut instinct, experience, that when some people suggest AI is just going to replace expertise or we won't need expertise, I think it's important we pause and we realize there's so much uncertainty that it's not like AI is magically going to know everything. We're still our human models, own models of the world as practicing physicians, I think in some ways will become more important when you don't just need that rote memorization that was rewarded in the past.
I'll give a more practical example of that in our own work. We found that the products that end up doing better are those that have an expert in the industry that is helping to build a product. And by build a product, very bluntly, copy and paste their mind into a prompt, which then generates a better response from the model. So if we're working in an industry like in book publishing or a PR agency or a mortgage broker, which are all kind of clients of ours, we've seen that the responses that the model could end up giving over time are like, it's hard to say better or worse, right? It's hard to have benchmarks on these things. But when they're getting it in front of customers, at least, they're seeing that, oh, wow, the model is responding a lot better than maybe the client could have, a client's client could. And the hypothesis is that it's because they are experts first, and then they're able to use that into creating the right prompts, which then get the right responses back. And so it aligns with what you're sharing, which is AI is not going to necessarily, at some roles, it could, augment or replace over time. But generally, at least today, the best products or the best ways to be able to elicit the right responses actually come from experts who could use these tools a little bit better. Is that how you're feeling about it as well?
Yeah, totally. I think so. In a world where it's not only free to distribute information from the internet, it's free to generate information now too. Obviously, there's energy costs and there's inference costs, etc. We need more than anything. We need perspective. we need perspective. And I think moving forward, that will be a central and even more central, right? It exists. It's not like today we don't offer perspective, but that will become an even more central aspect of what, clinicians do or nurses do, is offering perspective. Whereas, you used a generative AI product to ask a bunch of questions about your health and you got these answers, and it's overwhelming, right? Like, think of what you could do with Google today and the rabbit holes you can go down, or Reddit. Now think of when that feels really real and it feels like another human is speaking with you. That could be overwhelming to manage. So I think connecting with another human who's experienced and has expertise in an area and has lived experience of working with people, other people who have been through situations like yours, I think that will really be a key value that human physicians and nurses and other clinicians deliver.
In your work, when you're highlighting maybe some of these pros and cons, but maybe even how to be able to use AI for different physicians and doctors today, what are you guiding them to use? Like, how are you recommending that they start to experiment? Are there certain frameworks that you're thinking through of, if you're doing X, then try Y? If you're in this specific type of specialization, then I think this would be better for you. What is your goal even with trying to help educate all these folks about AI in healthcare? And then when you're working with other physicians or other peers, how are you getting them to start to try this? What are the use cases that you think are really supportive today?
My goals fundamentally is to help people understand this stuff looks like magic, but it isn't, right? There's no magic. Help people understand that these tools can help, but they can also hurt. Help people understand that we should be optimistic about harnessing these tools for benefit. Yet at the same time, we have to recognize that things are much harder than they may seem. And the payoff is going to take a lot of work and will not happen tomorrow. It's going to occur in the future. So that's really the goal. The goal is to avoid those polar extremes of everything's going to be perfect, everything's going to be terrible, utopia, dystopia. That's not helpful. The goal is to help people understand and have thoughtful conversations so we can shape the world we want to live in. In terms of your question, like, where are areas that I recommend people start? First, I think healthcare is a little different than most industries because the stakes are high, right? The stakes are high in other industries, financial, trading, transportation, entertainment. Right? The stakes are high in all industries.
This would be someone's life, though. This is a different...
Yeah, but this is someone's life, and we have to be careful. So where we're seeing AI penetrate right now primarily is on what's more known as the administrative side of healthcare. And I've argued that it's hard to separate administrative from clinical, but think of things like writing notes. So if you came to see me in the office and we spoke for a while, I would have to write a note to document what we discussed and what I did and what I recommended. In part, I have to write those notes to benefit future physicians who may want to see what went on, including my future self if I see you again. In part, I believe I write the note to help clarify my own thinking, but largely we write those notes to satisfy billing requirements. And very few physicians like writing notes, and it takes a lot of time and effort and energy, and often happens in nights and weekends. And so it's an area where there's a lot of pain and an area where there's a lot of enthusiasm for on that task. So the biggest area of investment right now, both from a startup perspective and but also from a health system perspective, is automating, or at least partially automating, the note writing process through different ambient intelligence solutions. So that would be one area where healthcare is moving forward. There's also attempts to use AI to do things like patient messaging. You send me a message and you say, "Hey, doctor, I'm not feeling so well. You recommended I do this, but now I'm doing worse." So there are a lot of those messages that come in to healthcare providers, and it also takes a lot of time and effort. And the question is, could we use AI to at least help us write drafts back to you? Just like Outlook or Gmail or most modern email platforms have some sort of generative response there as well. So that's an area. And then there's a lot of things around coding and billing and risk scoring. And that's where the bulk of the energy, or the short-term energy, is right now, is can we help you do things that are not necessarily clinical, that are safe, that kind of takes some drudgery off your plate? So I think that's where we're seeing things right now. And I work on some of these areas. I totally support it. I think there are challenges, though, of course. one of the challenges is that it's hard to disconnect administrative from clinical, right? So when I write your note, like that's part of your clinical care. It's also part of the administrative work. Or if you send me a message saying, hey, I'm feeling much better after surgery last week, can I go back to work? I don't know. Is that a clinical thing or is it an administrative thing? The world is complex, which is a common theme of what I'd like to think and discuss.
And why does that distinction matter? Clinical versus administrative, because there are other regulatory issues of working clinical versus, is that
forget the regulatory, the technology is imperfect, right? So if we're going to apply imperfect technology to tasks, we want to apply them in areas where there's less likely to be risk. Now, yes, the regulatory on top of that, and that's evolving and it's unclear, but yes, it's largely what's your risk tolerance? In my mind, and you probably have a more informed decision about this, but in my mind, the challenge with the technology, at least the newer generative AI modalities, is the reliability issue, right? These tools are imperfectly reliable. So if we're going to apply an imperfect reliable tool to a task, let's make sure there's a relatively low cost of making a mistake. Now, you can argue, we'll insert a human in the loop, right? Human physician in the loop, so that can reduce the risk of a mistake down. But the reality is that human in a loop is what Cory Doctorow calls a fig leaf, right? Like it's actually really hard for humans to remain in the loop. And the example I love is like the TSA, the baggage screeners, when they send these undercover TSA agents in to kind of assess how well they're doing. They only find fake weapons, I think it's about 10% of the time, whereas they're really good at finding water bottles. Why? Because almost no one carries a weapon in their bag, whereas a lot of people carry water bottles in their bag. There's this neurological phenomenon where we're just, as human beings, not very good at paying attention to things very infrequently.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, human in the loop, in theory, sounds really nice, but when that human is in the loop, they just don't really want to be in the loop.
We see this already. We see this outside of AI. So for instance, when I'm what's called an attending physician, there are different stages of physicians through training. There are residents and fellows who are young doctors just got out of training. They can't practice on their own. They need to be supervised. When they see patients, they write notes. And then the notes have to go to attending physicians, like full-fledged physicians or whatever you want to call us, to review the note and correct any mistakes and sign off on it. And if you pay enough attention, and I'm not saying I don't do this too, but there's a lot of this, they're smart. They know what they're doing. Just like I'm sure all of us do. You do it, I'm sure, in your business when an intern or a junior collaborator does something. You're like, I just don't have time to pay that much attention. Yeah, exactly. So human in the loop is a very appealing concept and way of mitigating risk, but also not such a thing. Or it's a thing on some levels, but there are limits to that approach as well.
That's really interesting. Then if the focus of AI in healthcare is on places where it's a little bit less risky, and if it is more risky, then there's at least a human in the loop. But if the problem with human in the loop is that they just don't really want to be in the loop, or their attention span is a little bit low, then should we be incentivizing people differently to be like a human in the loop? For example, at least when you're building software products, and we're noticing this for some of our clients, is that we need to hire a quality assurance person. Why? Because sometimes the customer asks for something, we build something, we're about to ship it, and we realize at the last moment that actually we may have missed a specific requirement, or it doesn't really align well with what the original request was from a customer. And right now, no one's really incentivized, like from a performance basis, actually, to say, no, this is not aligned with what we originally thought, and then try to remedy it. I wonder if you've been thinking through that, where, okay, assuming the human in the loop is not going to be that useful, how do we incent them to be more useful? Is there some sort of performance-based kind of compensation that's given to them if they can identify not just identify the water bottle coming through TSA, but actually be able to find the weapon? I'm sure organizations have thought about this, but have you thought about this in your use case?
Yeah, that's so yes, incentives matter. Incentives matter, right? Econ 101 is incentives matter a lot, right? There's that Charlie Munger quote, show me the incentive and I'll show you the behavior. Maybe I mixed that up, but right, that's just fundamental to human behavior. But when you talk about incentives in healthcare, obviously our incentives are all over the place and often misaligned between different stakeholders. At least the US healthcare system, despite discussion for probably a decade and a half about value-based care, most The overwhelming majority of US healthcare providers are paid on a fee for service basis, meaning you get paid to do things, right? You get paid to do more of certain things, and you don't necessarily get paid based on the quality of your work, which is a really elusive concept because quality is super hard to define. Going back to our grade, the world's more complicated, but you don't get paid for the quality of your work or for how well your patients are doing. You get paid to do things. So the incentive structure of American healthcare is just all wild and misaligned. And then when you talk about introducing AI into this incentive structure, it gets even more confusing because what is my incentive if I'm a private practice endocrinologist or if I'm an anesthesiologist or if I'm an occupational therapist? My incentive, hopefully, I'm intrinsically motivated to do best for the patients I'm taking care of. I want to get through my day, right? I want to get through my day so I can get home to my family and eat dinner on time. I want to make money, right? I do this job not just because I'm altruistic, but I also have to support myself, my family, whatever. And then the question is, so where does AI fit into that, right? AI generally is not AI products, healthcare AI products generally, they almost always cost money. So someone's got to pay for them. Very few of them are directly reimbursable. So if I start using it, it's not like I could charge patients more for it. I would argue they're just as likely to slow us down as to speed us up. They force us to change how we do our jobs, and no one likes to change, right? Individuals don't like to change. Groups of individuals really don't like to change. So when you talk about incentives, and this is a long-winded answer, I apologize for, but when you talk about incentives for using AI or incentives for being in the loop, maybe somehow, someday, but we're far from that right now.
Yeah, you've made it very, not to come across as like a pessimistic perspective here, you've made it very clear that AI adoption in healthcare is going to take a really long time if it really ever happens without some of the incentives that ended up happening in 2009 around EAM, where it was literally, we'll pay you more if you start to integrate more of these things. Yep. I don't know, as a society, or maybe some of the work that you're doing with health systems, or I'm sure like other government bodies, or maybe even consulting you a little bit on this too. Maybe the recommendation is let's just stop like with anything else outside of government incentives to be able to integrate AI. And then even within those, that you need to be very mindful of where you're actually applying that. Are you sensing, is that where the conversation is going today? Or do you still think that's like a pretty far...
I still think it's so early and the technology is so unproven in many ways. Of course, when we talk about AI, we tend to skew towards generative AI. AI has been around for a long time, of course, and a lot of it is not so risky and can be applied effectively. But even with that, so I think the government is figuring out what to do with at least the newer forms of AI and figuring out how to regulate this. I think the government is very far from incentivizing health systems, practices, individual physicians to use it. I think if there's value, it will be used. It'll be used slowly because I always think of like the enzymatic, what enzyme, you think of physical chemistry. I don't know if you took chemistry classes, but they always show you the rate of reaction. You need to overcome this kind of hill so you can get to a lower state of energy. So what's the catalyst, right? So you mentioned with electronic health records, it was big government money, meaningful use incentives. The other big technology shift that's occurred in my career, digital technology shift that's occurred in my career, was pivoting to virtual care during the pandemic. Why did health systems do it? Because they had to, right? Because their patients were afraid to leave their houses. They were afraid to see patients they didn't need to see. What will be the impetus to do that this time, to adopt AI? And I don't think we'll see a big bang. I think we'll see at the edges tools that seem to create value, however you define value. It's a nebulous concept, but tools that seem to create value will be adopted. So like we're seeing the ambient scribing solutions, the ambient documentation, because that seems to be making people's lives better. It's not super expensive. It's not cheap, but it seems like it's a worthwhile investment. But I think we'll see piecemeal adoption. I don't think we're likely to see a big bang all at once. We're going to start using this stuff. And also because AI is not one thing, right? Unlike electronic health records, like you could say there are different flavors, but the government said, these are the ones we're certifying. So it's a thing. So we're going to give you money to use that thing. Give us money to use AI. What does that mean?
Yeah.
AI is not a single thing. So it's pay us to use more predictive algorithms to identify the risk that someone's going to decompensate. All right, maybe. Tie more incentives, penalties, and bonuses to doing certain things more effectively. And there's a tool that allows you to do that more effectively. I think that's more likely to be the way that it gets adopted.
I love it. Spencer, I want to be mindful of your time as well. Before we wrap up, how can we help you? What's been on your mind? What has been, where have been the things that maybe you could use some of like our audience support or our support for, maybe like a call to action for folks, or we can wrap up the conversation maybe in that sense if you have anything on top of your mind.
I don't know who's listening, but it's based on what your company does. I assume builders, people who are building products. I think strongly the mindset that no one has all the right answers. And I usually run away from people who pretend that they do have all the answers. And I've been in healthcare now for 25 years. I like to think I know a bit about practicing medicine, but I'm just one opinion, one experience. So I think we need to just come together more, different stakeholders from different areas, different backgrounds, different experiences, different perspectives. And as a physician, I feel like I bring something to the table, but there are many gaps in my knowledge and my perspective. And so I guess that would be the call to action, is more connection between people with just different ways of seeing the world and different ways of approaching problems. And we need more of that in healthcare on both ends. People from inside the system need help from people outside the system. People from outside the system who want to build things certainly need help from people inside the system, so they build products that actually make a difference and people want to use. So that would be my kind of general call to action, is let's keep talking, let's socialize, share ideas, commit to building something better than what we have now. Be humble, realize, again, no one has all the answers. This isn't going to be fixed tomorrow, but work towards building a better future for everyone.
There goes to how we started the conversation even before recording around some of the pros and cons of living in New York as a city, where you have all these different types of people that are around, and they're coming from different types of backgrounds, and they're each sharing what are really important to them. And it's those, personally for me, after moving here, that's been a really big win, because the ideas are cross-pollinating in interesting ways. And whether it's an idea that I can share out or an idea that kind of comes into my mind, I'm thinking about a problem in a totally different way. And I think that just needs to continue to happen, like across any single industry or kind of like walk of life. So I love that. I love that call to action. Spencer, it was great having you on.
Hey, great being with you.